My name's Matthew Griffin. I'm a futurist, but really I'm a strategic advisor who looks at the future to then work with different government organizations and multinationals around the world to help them understand the future that we are going into, build the future that we're going into, and then in some cases lead it. Now, during this presentation, I'm going to be having a conversation with you about how to think like a futurist, but I'm going to be giving you examples. I'm going to be taking you on a journey to 2071, which is the UAE's centennial, and we're going to be exploring all sorts of things that you frankly didn't think that you were going to hear today, or maybe even ever. We're also going to solve roughly 6 UN SDGs. So, putting a little bit of clarity on this, with a lot of futurists, people think, well, okay, a futurist is an individual who goes and has a random conversation with a set of different shareholders and stakeholders about some wishy-washy, science fiction-like thing that might or might not ever transpire. So I work with organizations like Airbus, where we are building the future of urban air mobility. I work with organizations like ARM. Every single one of you uses ARM semiconductors day in, day out, almost every single minute. And with ARM, we talk about the future of computing up to 2030, where we talk about plastic computers, biological computers, the future of all kinds of different industries. With organizations like Aviva are actually running ADNOC's control centers. So we talk about the future of Industry 4.0, digital twins, oil and gas, energy, all of that sort of stuff. Same with Centrica. Companies like Decathlon, Nike and Adidas, the future of sports, health and wellness, where we are 3D printing Adidas sneakers in the back of a store, which eliminates your entire global supply chain, which is something we'll come on to. Organizations like Disney, where we talk about being able to push a single artificial intelligence button to produce the next Marvel movie in 2030, 2035. That is a deep fake and a synthetic content conversation, which we won't be having today. The UAE government on the future of jobs, skills and education, GEMS on future curriculums, because in my estimation, educators have got one of the toughest jobs of anybody. If I go into a regular business or a government, we might be talking 5 years out, 20 years out. If it's Samsung or Huawei, it's 50 years out. But with educators, they've got to prepare students and your children, as well as you, for a future that hasn't been written yet. If you look at the past 10, 20, or 30 years, how much change have you seen at a societal level, at a professional level, at an individual level? Now figure the amount of change in 50 years. That's what educators are trying to prepare your children for. And things are getting faster. But also, companies like Huawei, Legal & General. So Legal & General basically have about $1.6 trillion under asset. This is where we come to talking about shaping the future. LinkedIn, they're interested in quite a lot of different things, frankly. Microsoft, future of artificial intelligence. The impact of AI on the workforce. PwC, Rolls-Royce, Qualcomm, future of chips again. Samsung, they have Chaos Labs trying to look at the next 50 years to figure out what does your next phone look like? What does the next semiconductor look like? What do the next computer components look like? T-Mobile, basically with 5G, 6G, 7G, and quantum communications. So when we sort of look at this land that is a future, there's a huge amount going on. And it's not easy trying to think like a futurist. Now, what's the most powerful thing in the known universe? Is it A, black hole, which we have actually replicated in a lab? We created a miniature black hole by focusing a load of lasers at a single point, and the atoms started collapsing, and we had a molecular-sized black hole that the Large Hadron Collider guys said, thank heavens it wasn't a gravitational black hole. So, is the most powerful thing in the universe a black hole, or is it an idea? Because if I put an idea in your head, If I put an idea in 1 billion people's heads, it's like that itch in your brain. If I say, can we do X? It's the itch that you can't scratch. It's the itch that you can't get rid of. And ideas come from knowledge. So here's my idea. So firstly, everything I'm going to be talking about is downloadable in these sort of codexes. So how to build exponential enterprises, the trends codex, these are relevant. There are over 170 megatrends listed in there, things like climate change and everything else. There's over 250 exponential technologies. Bearing in mind, we take these technologies, combine them together to create next generation product and service, and the other codex. This is my gift to you, a bit selfishly, the gift of knowledge. Now, as for my idea, let's solve global famine forever. While we're solving global famine forever, why don't we solve future water wars? Whether it's here in the Middle East, whether it's Egypt, whether it's conflict zones, whatever it happens to be. While we're solving UN SDGs 2 and 3, why don't we actually solve 6 as well? Why don't we look at solving health? I said that we can solve 6 UN SDGs. If I can solve famine, I can solve climate change. I can solve life below water because climate change is affecting life below water, UN SDG 13 and 14. I can also start helping solve life on land, UN SDG 15. So this is how we do it. Let's solve global famine. Today, we grow crops in fields. If you lived in a desert, for example, outside of Abu Dhabi, and I said, I want you to raise cows, cattle, sheep, I want you to grow crops, it's very difficult to do. Now what we can do is we can create a vertical farm like the ones we have on the Sheikh Zayed Road in Masdar, and it's a farm like this, and I grow my crops in a building. I can grow crops 8 times the yield, fully organic, with 99% less water. I'm starting to solve the water problem, UN SDG 6. I'm also starting to solve hunger. However, you don't necessarily want to continually eat meat or eat veg. So let's talk how we bring meat to the UAE. The UAE imports about 97-98% of all its food. Cellular agriculture. If I asked you, as non-futurists perhaps, how do you solve global famine, you probably wouldn't have come up with this. What I do is I take a cell from any animal, a cow, a zebra, a chicken, a duck. I put it in a bioreactor and I grow meat. Genuine meat, not plant-based meat, not fake meat, not synthetic meat. We take what goes on inside of an animal, we just do it outside of an animal. Now I've solved crops. Now I've solved meat. I've cut carbon emissions by 70%. I've also cut global water consumption by 50 to 60%, bearing in mind that agriculture uses almost all the water up. And this is how I do it. This is a real thing. So meet Ian the chicken and see people eat him without killing him.
We've all been there, right? In the grocery store. Oh, I'll just buy this meat. And there it is. And all we have to do is buy it. We don't have to think about what it took to make that chicken in that nice packaging. But the reality of the way that it came about, it's incredibly unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now. But we figured out a way to solve it. The whole idea is that that chicken in itself has an unlimited source of itself, and there is a way where you can take just a handful of cells and keep growing them essentially infinitely. For those very first cells, it was important to us how we got the cells, not just that we got the cells. We came up with the idea to use one feather from the single best chicken that we could find.
We picked out.
The first thing we need to do is we need to identify a cell that we are going to use as the basic starter material. And then what we need to do is find a food for it to grow in. So we have to identify the right set of nutrients that will cause the cells to multiply, but not just multiply, but do so quickly and into high densities.
Wake up, I wanna lift you up, I wanna dress you up, let's be friends.
It was an out-of-body experience to sit there and eat a chicken, but have the chicken that you're eating running around in front of you. You don't imagine doing something like that.
So if you want to have those, that's part of KFC's Future Food program. You can go to the US and buy those nuggets as well as beef burgers, steaks, all kinds of other things. You can also go to Singapore because it's been regulated and approved. So now we have meat without the animal. Basically, we have vertical farms and all that sort of stuff. So now you literally can live in the middle of a desert, basically, and you can be very, very well fed. Now, when it comes to thinking like a futurist, this is probably one of the hardest presentations because inside of my head, it's frankly just chaos. It's like one of those silly string things. Now, this is typically how I do it. So I use this three-sided triangle. On the left-hand side, we're trying to figure out what are the problems worth solving that as businesses or governments, we can either make money from or benefit from. On the right-hand side, that's all the exponential technologies because we know what our problem is. What are the different technologies that we can combine together to create our next generation product or service? And then at the bottom is the when. I have my new product. When can my citizens use it? When will it affect my business? And that is difficult because we have Ian the chicken. He helps solve global hunger. However, we have to scale the technology. The technology has to be accessible, it has to be affordable, and all these kinds of things. Because if a chicken nugget costs $1 million, it doesn't touch the sides on global famine. But if it costs nothing, that might be a little bit of a different story. So as a futurist, you're looking for change and problems, and these are everywhere. This is kind of trend hunting. Now, you've also got to think, when you find a signal, a trend, climate change, for example, what does that actually mean? And then, what problems does that create? So, for example, climate change, what does that mean? It means we have more extreme weather. Why is that a problem? Because it can destroy cities and it can cause forest fires and all that sort of stuff. So this is really how we're looking at what are the problems worth solving. And then we think, how? How do we communicate those problems and that change to the stakeholders and to the shareholders who we think should understand the threats that these pose, but also the benefits? And then how do we solve them? So for example, this is where you go to the UAE government and say, we think that climate change is causing extreme weather, it's causing extreme heat, and in Dubai, in the summer, it's already very hot. So in 20 to 30 years' time, Dubai needs to be resistant enough to withstand temperatures that are starting to edge towards 55 to 60 degrees Celsius. Therefore, today, we have the problem, and this is how we solve it. Now, when it comes to solving the problem, you need to think about technology combinations. So, for example, we need climate-resilient infrastructure in Dubai. So, what technologies are coming together today that could help us solve this problem quickly? Bearing in mind we've got a lot of legacy infrastructure as well. So, one of the technologies that we could actually use could be 3D printing. So we could say, well, why don't we 3D print buildings that are thicker, that are more resistant to climate change, that are 3D printed with new materials, materials that radiate heat as opposed to absorb heat. and so on and so forth. So with this particular problem, we are combining 3D printing with new materials to create buildings that don't turn into ovens in Dubai in the year 2050. And then, do these technologies exist today? Yes, they do. We can do this today. Therefore, as a government program, we can start putting in new regulations, new schemes and policies to start climate proofing Dubai, as well as doing other things depending on the problem that we've seen. However, what's next? And this is the futurist bit. So you can see the technologies we have today to maybe 3D print buildings in new ways or make buildings in new ways. But what's next? If we can 3D print a building today, what's next? Now, in this particular case, this is called jumping the curve. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to look for the next technology. So if we combine 3D printing with artificial intelligence can be used to design even more climate resilient buildings. It can also be used to create new materials with new unique properties. And then you've got to think exponential. So if we step back 10 years ago, trying to 3D print something like the Museum of the Future would have been really, really difficult. Today, it's getting increasingly straightforward. Still not maybe easy, but it's increasingly straightforward. So think exponential. Now, I mentioned technologies. I track over 450 exponential technologies. When you combine these different technologies together, that's your new product or service. This phone isn't one technology. It's a screen, it's a computer chip, it's sensors, it's materials, it's all kinds of different goodies. So what we do, this is my starburst and this is in the codexes, we start looking at all the different technologies, their different states of maturity, and we look at it and say, if this is the problem that we're going to solve, or would like to solve, then today, the technologies that are mature enough for us to use are these, the ones that are closer to the center. And you find the ones that you can combine. The ones that are sort of further out, so for example, if I said, well, why don't we use a molecular assembler to help us with the building problem in Dubai? That's actually a thing, but those technologies are very early stage today. They do exist, but they're very early stage today. Really, you're looking at 2060, 2070. If I said, I'll tell you what, well, why don't we use synthetic biology, where I create a seed that has a particular genome, and I plant it in the ground, and it turns into a building. We actually have, like trees come from a seed. We are already at the point where we can turn different organic organisms, cells, into different shapes, like triangles and rectangles and everything else. So if I said, if you want to create buildings in the future, just take a single seed, plant it into the ground, and just watch it turn into a government office, you'd be like crazy, right? But as synthetic biology as a technology starts maturing, in 20, 30, 40 years, it's less crazy. So when we're talking about solving problems, we're trying to solve for today, but then we're trying to look ahead to figure out what technologies are coming down the pipeline that we could use. And then we filter them. We go good, bad, stupid, other. And we sort of go around the wheel and everything else. And then nothing is impossible. So in this particular, and this is the thing, so as a futurist, nothing is impossible. If one of your problems is that you have a paralyzed patient in hospital who cannot communicate with their loved ones, like ALS patients, basically paralyzed patients and everything else, what I can do today is I can take a variety of different science fiction-like technologies. I can take artificial intelligence, a brain-machine interface. I can put a BMI on their head, and as they think images, these are the images that are displayed. We're already using brain-machine interfaces in hospital settings to help people with ALS communicate in sentences and images. Nothing is impossible. I can also use this same technology in about 3 to 5 years to stream whatever it is you are thinking in both images and what you are thinking in words to YouTube. So as a futurist, I can guarantee nothing is impossible. We have molecular assemblers, we have tractor beams, we have another one which is the future of knowledge, which I will show you later. And then as a futurist, I take all these different things and then we sort of filter them into probable futures, plausible futures, possible futures, and outrageous, preposterous futures. And then we take these and then we go and have a conversation with those shareholders and stakeholders and say, so, if you want to build buildings in new ways, my probable future is you can 3D print the buildings today. My preposterous future is I can use a molecular assembler. And it's preposterous today, but in 30, 40, 50 years, that could be the one that is plausible. And then probable. And then we think when. So we've got all this funky stuff. When can I use a molecular assembler to create a new Burj Khalifa? And so on and so forth. And that's kind of the process. Now, when it comes to shaping the future, this is good old business execution. It's no good just talking about the future. I could stand on stages around the world talking about these futures that we could create. But unless you actually do, they never come to pass. So in Dubai, you're obviously doing. Singapore, obviously doing. That's the first thing. You've got to be clear about your objective. So is your individual or societal objective, what is it that you want to do? We want food security. Okay. Create your call to action. You want people who can help you improve your food security. And you can create a community or you can create a company. You can build a movement. Because when people come together, interesting things happen. And no one can do this alone. Accumulate resources. I started my business with $50. I'm now influencing almost every single product and service that you guys use. Whether it's the design of your smartphones, the computer chips in your smartphones, your bank accounts, especially with things like FAB, and so on and so forth. Future of transportation with the RTA, the lights and the energy that comes from above with Dewar, and so on. Yeah. The education via GEMS or the KHDA. But you've got to accumulate resources. Now, when we talk about accumulating resources, you can either go and get money to get resources, but that's difficult as a startup and an individual, unless you have a nice PE or VC. But if you have a movement and people can collaborate together and they share their time, that can achieve the same goal. So you can accumulate resources without spending money. And then focus. Because as any entrepreneur will tell you, if you're trying to do 20 different things all at the same time, you're generally going to fail at 20 things. Focus. So in terms of seeing the future, it is quite chaotic. In terms of building it, though, that's a business execution thing that most of you do day in, day out. And then you have to persist. So my personal mission is to transform the global education system. I've been working with different authorities, basically in Dubai, to do that. I've created a virtual reality university because trying to change the education system as it is from within is really difficult. So I've gone outside of it. I have 2 young children, basically, whose education system at the minute is not preparing them for anything that's here today, let alone what's coming. So you have to persist. You'll face all kinds of roadblocks. Now, I mentioned about future knowledge. You already have 2 brains. You've had 2 brains for a very, very long time. So knowledge is this kind of amorphous thing. When you try to get access to information and data, your brain then turns that into knowledge. Your phone has been a second brain for a very long time. When someone posted on Reddit and said, how would you explain the smartphone to somebody who came from the past? The top answer was you would explain it as the device that gives you access to all of the world's information. So you already have two brains. You already have access to almost all of the world's knowledge or information or data, but generally we combine it together to create knowledge. 2 years ago, have you ever watched The Matrix? So Trinity in The Matrix needs to know how to fly a Huey helicopter. And she goes, dial me up a helicopter. And it's produced in a metaverse-like environment. They upload the information to fly the Huey helicopter directly to her brain. 2 years ago, in the United States military, the bleeding edge research arm called DARPA took 30 Top Gun pilots, put them into an F-35 simulation, took the F-35 up to 35,000 feet, put it into a flat spin, recorded the pilot's brain waves, and then tried to crash the plane, while the pilots are struggling to actually land it. All the pilots landed it, and all their brain waves were recorded. They then took 30 volunteers who had never ever flown a plane before, put them in the same simulation, took them to 35,000 feet, put the F-35s into a flat spin. 70% of the people landed the plane. 30% didn't because they didn't have the kinetic responses. So by replaying the Top Gun's brain waves to these volunteers, they uploaded knowledge. This is now a $50 million program with companies like, or with universities like Carnegie Mellon and so on and so forth, because the brain is plastic. And when you all say, well, it's impossible to upload knowledge to your brain, I'm doing that now, aren't I? But your brain has been tuned to take in information in verbal form, sight, all that kind of stuff. With this technology, we're using brain-machine interfaces, artificial intelligence, and everything else to digitize that process and circumvent you needing to actually watch video on demand or whatever it happens to be. And that is an interesting program. Now we have new knowledge. So Google has an artificial intelligence unit called DeepMind. DeepMind is one of the world's best artificial intelligence units. What they did is they managed to create something called a zero-shot learning artificial intelligence. That's a kind of artificial intelligence that learns by itself. In this case, they gave it the rules for chess, and then that was it. It started creating loads of different games and everything else. But what they found was it created new knowledge. They didn't put it in a game simulation like we normally do with AIs. It learned how to play chess itself. It learned new moves by itself. It learned new strategies by itself. It created, in their own words, new knowledge in ways that humans hadn't done before. And this leads us to this, the Centaur principle. If you go and read any kind of newspaper, except maybe the Kajil Times, because it tends to be a little bit more upbeat, you'll see that artificial intelligence is supposed to be coming for all our jobs. What happens when you as a human, with your logical brain, are partnered with an artificial intelligence? Now, with the Go champion, the South Korean Go champion was beaten comprehensively by an artificial intelligence called AlphaGo years and years ago. And they said, you must be really, really upset that as the world champion, you got beaten comprehensively by an artificial intelligence. Same with Garry Kasparov in the 1980s with Deep Blue from IBM. And he said, yeah, I was gutted. And then the press went away. And then they went back to him about 2-3 months later and said, look, are you still really gutted that an artificial intelligence beat you? And they expected him to say yes. But he said no. I said, well, that's a bit odd. Exactly the same with Garry Kasparov. The reason why he said no was because of move 34. He said the artificial intelligence did a move that no human would ever have made. It used a strategy that I have never ever seen before. And that AI taught me a whole new branch of strategy that I'd never ever contemplated before. And now I'm an even better Go player. So this is called the Centaur principle, where we as humans are great at kind of creative, messy, logical thinking. Well, creative thinking. AIs, at the minute, with artificial intelligence being narrow, is good at logical thinking. When you tie the two together, you get this superhuman intelligence. So when we start talking about the future of work, workplace, jobs, education and skills, we shouldn't really be talking so much about being automated by AI. We should be talking more about it helping us to solve some of the world's greatest challenges, which it can, but that's a different conversation. And then when we talk about artificial intelligence not being creative or innovative, we have creative artificial intelligences like these. Airbus is using an artificial intelligence to design the A330neo. We had an artificial intelligence within Silico that designed 30,000 new drugs in 21 days. We've got NASA who are using creative artificial intelligence to design new kinds of space rovers. And if you go online, Under Armour's artificial intelligence created a new sneaker in one day. That sneaker could be 3D printed on day 2. That cuts the time from concept to shelf down by over 99%. Everything gets faster. But imagine now putting a behavioral interface over the front of this thing and saying, computer, design me some new clothes, which Amazon's doing. Computer, design me a new car, which Ford are doing. Fundamentally, we change what we're able to do as a society and the speed at which we can do it because we can 3D print it out the back. Now, when we have a look at post-COVID, crisis revolutionizes society. It's done it every single time. In the 1300s, the result, basically, of the Black Plague in Europe meant that more Europeans went off exploring because people said to them, or said to us, I'm kind of a European, you can either stay in this plague-ridden city or you can get on the ship that you didn't want to get on and possibly die at sea. But because there was the Black Plague that was killing everyone, people took the risk. And they went off and they found new lands. The printing press, it's believed the printing press was invented for the simple reason that the people who normally write out all the different manuscripts and documents were dying in their droves. So we needed to find a way to automate the creation of content. And that's something we're doing again today, just in a different way. Then when we have a look at 1918, we saw significant improvements in gender relations. We also saw a startup boom. Now, does that sound familiar with COVID? We have a massive startup boom because of COVID, because so many people were made redundant. They couldn't find jobs, and so they went, you know what, if I cannot find a job, I'm going to start a company, or I'm going to die trying. And hopefully they succeeded. But COVID-19 accelerated things. So what would normally take organizations decades took them days. I was having a conversation with the Bahraini government the other day. It took them 3 days to turn the airport into a hospital. And they said, we'd never been able to do that before because of the processes. So when we look at COVID-19, particularly from a government perspective, figure out why as a government you were suddenly able to move so fast, or as a business, and codify it. Not enough businesses are codifying the lessons from COVID-19 to help improve the flexibility and agility. Forced adoption. We all ended up using digital, whether we liked it or not. And forced innovation. We all had to innovate new products, new ways of talking to one another, whatever it happened to be. But from a COVID perspective, remember the lessons. It's estimated that in 6 months' time, when the pandemic has come to an end, most people will just go, oh, it's that thing that happened. Remember it. You had a virus that took the universe's most sophisticated and complex being down. It's a humbling experience. So, as we start having a look towards the next pandemic, we have ways to build resilience. We also have ways to completely prevent it, as well as reduce the impact. So firstly, as I think Mona and the previous panel said, the UAE was actually a little bit ahead of the curve for the pandemic because they're already digitizing everything. So government on the blockchain, digital government and so on and so forth. Digitize everything. Secondly, when we talk about the supply chain problems that we see right now, you can either flatten your supply chains. So if you typically create a product that has 300 parts, collapse it down to 100 parts. It's called flattening the supply chain. And then, like Adidas and Nike, Why not just get rid of the supply chain completely and keep some material in the back of your store and then 3D print these sneakers? Additive manufacturing proved during the COVID-19 pandemic that when supply chains broke, exponential technologies took up the slack. In fact, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, they all accelerated like crazy because they made up for problems with the supply chain. And then, as from a work perspective, you can work from anywhere. You've been able to work from anywhere for ages. You can work in the office. And people suggest 2 days in, 3 days out. Thanks to space internet systems, you can work in the middle of the desert. But more than that, you can work anywhere. So not only can you work from anywhere, you can work anywhere. And these glasses, as everything gets smaller, those glasses are the future of virtual reality headsets. It's VR in sunglasses. And then you can work from anywhere.
With an acute heart attack.
So you can work
the total
anywhere
transfer time to
from
get
anywhere.
her to our hospital.
What about
was 3
remote
hours.
surgery?
There's a feeling of helplessness as a physician that you know what the treatment is to limit their chance of death, but you can't get to them.
Our hypothesis is that if we implement remote robotics in its full capacity, we will change the lives for hundreds of thousands of patients in the US and millions around the world.
Using technologies like 5G networks and robotic systems to provide cardiac care at a distance and be able to do telestenting has the potential to change the landscape of medicine. 5G technology really opens up the possibility to do these over longer distances with minimal delays in signal and transmitting greater amounts of data.
Being able to reach a patient hundreds of miles away to deliver the care they need when they need it is one of the most disruptive things happening in the medical industry.
So in the UK, for example, we had surgeons who were in lockdown and having to work from home, but they were still able to conduct surgeries on people in St. Bart's and St. Guy's hospitals. So you can work anywhere from anywhere. It's a flip. And then when we talk about beating the next pandemic, and we're kind of there, it used to take 5 to 10 years to create a vaccine. We'd figure out basically what the bug was. We'd then create a vaccine. That would take ages. We'd then run 3 to 5 months worth of human trials, if not years, for example, with Ebola. We managed to create the COVID-19 vaccine within 3 months. It then took longer to come out because we needed to run human trials. The next pandemic, 2025, 2030, even if it's soon, we'll be able to create vaccines in real time in terms of the compounds, the molecular structure, and everything else. And then, when it comes to what the next pandemic could be, here's the kicker. Technology can be used for good and evil. We already have the tools, courtesy of synthetic biology, we had them 3 years ago, to create the next pandemic for under $20,000. 3 years ago, researchers in Canada used synthetic biology and genetic engineering technologies like CRISPR to de-extinct the previously extinct horsepox virus. They took it to the World Health Organization and the world leaders and said, look, we created this with $100,000 in our garage, and the World Health Organization, and this is public, said what is remarkable about this achievement is that they de-extincted a highly contagious and deadly virus with relatively no money or resources, relatively no skill, in a really short space of time. This is bioweapon territory. In fact, CRISPR and gene drives have now been called by the United Nations as the world's ultimate weapons. So, and as the cost of synthetic biology comes down from 100,000 to 20,000, eventually this will cost $100 and be done by a 3D printer in some terrorist's garage. The current pandemic cost us over $30 trillion, as well as the societal hit. So when we talk about solving the next pandemic, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to be able to detect it. That is a big data problem. For a start, people start reporting symptoms. You know, you crawl Google and all that kind of stuff. Biooptical sensors. How many of you can tell me right now that there is absolutely no COVID particles in the air? None of you. However, if you use a biooptical sensor, when that COVID particle in the air hits a piece of clothing or a face mask or whatever it happens to be, that clothing will glow because it has RNA in it that gets activated and then illuminates. So biooptical sensors. These are as a result of the pandemic. They were created by MIT and Harvard. Observations. We have observation networks looking out for pandemics. And then wearables. Because increasingly, the wearables on your wrist can baseline your health and then start telling you that you're getting ill. And increasingly, it's the sensors, because everybody ignores sensors. As the sensors get more sensitive, they can figure out your biomarkers, your biochemistry, your biomechanics, and all manner of other things, as well as your biometrics. So we have new ways to detect future pandemics before they even really become a pandemic. We can look at the wastewater, for example, the alert systems that we've already developed. Gene sequencing. If you step back about 10, 20 years ago, it would cost you $1 billion to sequence the human genome. 2 weeks ago, we sequenced an entire human genome in 5.2 hours. By 2025, 2030, that will be real time. And I can do this with viruses. So now we get our COVID virus, or COVID generation 2 virus, we can sequence it instantly. There's no sending it to a lab waiting for weeks for the results and all that kind of stuff. And if we know the genetic makeup of the virus and its protein structure, we can now analyze it. Artificial intelligence is going quantum. So quantum computers, which are already here and they're coming really commercially available 2025, not only are these quantum computers incredibly powerful, but we have new forms of artificial intelligence already coming through. And then when it comes to vaccine development, today we used artificial intelligence, the Department of Energy's Summit supercomputer, which is the world's most powerful supercomputer, and genome sequencing to create a vaccine in 3 months. Quantum computers are immensely more powerful than logical computers. For example, they've been able to do calculations that would take the Summit supercomputer 3.5 billion years and do it in minutes because of the way they work. That's a whole conversation in itself. So vaccines could be developed in milliseconds by quantum computers. And then vaccine trials. You remember, as I said, you create your vaccine compound, you create your vaccine, and then you get a load of volunteers and you test it on the volunteers. 3 years ago, health organizations, especially in the military, started digitizing humans. They would actually take your MRI scans, your X-rays, your CTs, your PET scans, and everything else, and they would create a digital replica of the human. We can run these digital viruses, we can run these digital vaccines through a digital human to figure out whether they work or not. And if we kill the digital human, which we kill them in digital speed, by the way, we just start over again. So now we have a way to simulate the efficacy of a vaccine on a human without actually killing or hurting a real human. And then once we've figured out basically what works, what doesn't, then we go to human trials. But this process is the space of weeks. And then mass distribution. So we now figure out what vaccine actually works. We have a variety of different things on the table. The regulators will have kittens with the first one. We developed 3 years ago contagious vaccines. So imagine better you getting a pandemic in 2030. I give you a contagious vaccine, and then you breathe it out, sneeze all over someone else. All of a sudden, that solves the distribution problem. We've also got COVID vaccines today in chewing gum. We've also got them in pills where we can just post them out because not everyone has time, or the cold chains, the supply chains to go and have vaccines. We also have sprays because we've turned vaccines into aerosols. So now I could just post something out to you and you could spray yourself in the face. You now are immune, or protected would be a better word. However, this is a futurist's presentation. So I have 2 slides left. 2 years ago, we used synthetic biology to turn human liver cells into dual-core computers. We also have biological computers, 6th-generation biological computers, where we take a bacteria and we can store information and replay information from a bacteria. So it's a field called biological computing, DNA computing. So we've already demonstrated in the labs that we can turn human cells into dual-core computers. Now, if I convert you into a computer, this happens. COVID is going through your bloodstream. The computers in your cells detect the biomarker of COVID. Then they create the cure. So with the US military again, they have managed to demonstrate that your body can not only detect a disease within your own body and analyze it, but that we can then use it to create the cure. That's something called biomanufacturing, just in a weird way. And then, finally, why don't we just make you completely disease-proof? To the point, basically, where you could go to the most Ebola-infested place on the earth and walk around with impunity. This one is already here. It's been used on E. coli bacteria. It's also been used illegally in China, and the researcher got banged up for it. The regulators will not allow this until at least 2060, 2070. Now what this one is this is the use of genetic engineering. So I could spray an aerosol in your face that contains a genetic contains a genetic engineering tool. I can then rewrite your DNA. But when I can do that, and we've done it, because we've done it in China, and you can go and read about that and see how many years the guy got for doing it, I can do this. I can change the language, the DNA language that your cells speak. So when a virus goes into your body, it gets into your cells, and it hijacks your cellular machinery. And in order for the virus to replicate, it's like reading a book. The cellular machinery in your body has to read the book from the start to the finish. When it gets to the end of the book, it then replicates the virus, and you've now got 2 virus particles in your body, and then they keep going. By changing the way that human codons work, or bacterial codons work, the virus gets into your cells, hijacks your cellular machinery reads the makeup of the virus, it never gets to the end of the book. And because it never gets to the end of the book, officially, according to Harvard, MIT, University College of London, University of Cambridge, and all these others, you are now disease-proof. There is not a single pathogen on the planet that can hurt you. But as I say, even though we have that technology today, and it's been demonstrated in twins in China, as well as bacteria and all these sorts of other things, the regulators will have absolute kittens. And that's it. And that is how we identify the next pandemic, how we reduce its impact, and how we prevent them in the future, but with a futurist twist. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. Take care. Ta-da. Right. Thank you very much.